This week in Chapter 3, take a look at understanding social problems. And really, it's more about defining those social problems. But to really get at that and put this content into context, you kind of got to think back to what was discussed in Chapter 2. And I want to review some of the very important takeaways because you're going to be using this terminology throughout as you develop your program plan. So that first concept in Chapter 2, the theory of process of problem solving, that's the figuring out what is. That what is term is going to be discussed throughout, and those of you who have a job or a job prospect and extension, this will really be a term that's used quite a bit. What is going on? What is the actual problem? And sometimes, as the book discusses, there's all these different facets feeding into what is the problem. So figuring out, getting to the core of what is the cause, and not just putting a band-aid on something and hoping that that problem is solved when you really haven't taken a very close look at the cause, is what that's talking about when you're looking at the process of problem solving. The second part that was discussed in Chapter 2, which is very applicable here in Chapter 3, is the theory of a possible solution and action. So once you figure out what is the problem, now you're ready to say, okay, all right, that's the identified need right there. That's what is. We know what we want now is what should be. What is the intervention I'm going to put in place to make that change to what should be? So those two terms, what is, what should be, you're going to see discussed more in some of the assignments that you'll be doing in other videos that are going to be presented. Your book doesn't really use those terms, but in the world of extension program planning, that is used quite a bit. The third thing I want to remind you of here back in Chapter 2 was types of planning. There's strategic planning, management planning, and program planning. Strategic planning is the big picture, the what does the organization have? What is the vision, the mission, the goals? And hopefully the organization that you are working for has gone through a strategic plan and that's already been defined. Having said that, strategic plans need to be revised or revisited at least every 5 years because things change and maybe you implemented a program that was wildly successful and now that's taken care of itself. Maybe another entity has taken over that project. You can walk away. You've given birth. The child has grown and they're out there doing their own thing. So you have this strategic plan that your organization has, you know, the mission, the goals, the vision, and you're going for it. If that hasn't occurred yet, then you need to bring the folks together and go through a strategic plan, a strategic planning session. That is not the focus of this course. There are entire facilitators for doing strategic planning. There's whole probably courses set aside on strategic planning. But hopefully that's been set in motion for you, and in the context of this course, that has taken place. Management then is the management of the resources, the people and faculty, the actual activities or outputs, not activities, the actual resources that you have, the inputs that you have, and the management planning is the managing of those resources, not really putting them into any action. So that is explained in the text. You can revisit that. But the last one I want to spend a little time now is we're looking at the problems, and now we are able to hopefully gather all the information, find out what the cause is, and put forth some ideas for a program plan, the actual intervention that's going to change things from what are right now, what is, to what should be. The assumption of program planning is that there is a problem. So whenever we talk about theories, we always are making some assumption to make our theory make sense. And so we are assuming in program planning that there is a problem. And so if you haven't done a good job of figuring out what is, and that has been defined by facts, there's evidence to support that, and what should be, which is typically defined by within context or our culture, what is acceptable, and they give you several examples in the book, then our program planning doesn't work if that doesn't exist. But if in fact there really is a problem and we have a defined what should be, now we have the impetus for developing a program. So that's kind of the assumption, the takeaway of the theories from Chapter 2. And the last thing that they add on in that chapter that is discussed and actually conceptually is brought throughout and all the way to the end when your program plan is being evaluated for funding, for example, or for inclusion into a particular organization, is the efficiency and the effectiveness related to that program plan. And that really links to this term you'll hear, value or worth of your program plan. So we're going to talk about that a lot more in this course, but but know this, that efficiency and effectiveness, as your chapter mentioned, your authors mentioned, may not be the same thing. Also keep in mind that in this book, and I don't know if I've mentioned this previously, if so I'll say it again, this book takes a lot of examples from social settings, from domestic abuse to drug abuse to all of those different sorts of things that may not be totally related to your content area. Try not to focus on that. Focus on the process and apply your content or the context or the lens to which to view the processes that are going to be discussed in your text. And that's what these little videos will do. That's hopefully what the project you're working on will do. Your book is explaining a process. We'll switch up some terminology to make it probably more meaningful to you, especially if you're going into extension programming, but it really is about the process. This term, though, efficiency and effectiveness, related to value, is really important. And sometimes this is a very difficult thing to measure because you are, for example, I'll give you a story here. I had a professor and he worked in the what was called the FCHD department at the time, Family Consumer Science area. And his whole thing was to measure relationships. And he presented a paper and it got rejected. And he went to a statistician and he said, my paper was rejected. This is the problem they're having with the statistics that were run. Can you help me do something better here with the statistics? And the statistician took a look at it and said, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You are trying to measure love? And with that, he chuckled out loud and realized he was measuring something that was a pretty ill-structured conceptually. What does it really mean, defining those terms? And so he was measuring the effectiveness of different interventions on love. And so that was something that was really hard to put a value on unless you really define what that is within context. So we'll be coming back and talking a little bit more about this. But remember, just because something is efficient, maybe very inexpensive, does not mean that it's super effective. Conversely, if we have something that seems to be really effective but is costing us a ton of money, the effect size, if you will, to put a statistical term on it, might be outside of our reach. So it's something that we're always trying to balance in a program plan. Another table or figure that they had for you in there that I thought was really useful is this business as usual and this analytical approach. And I've posted, I believe, a discussion question about this, whether you think that it's a business as usual approach, things going on, versus the analytical approach where you have a problem analysis based on an existing theory of research, you have current profile for those in need in the community, and then your approach is to service based on those new and current understandings of the problem and the need. That's why strategic plans, management plans, and even programs have to be revisited and evaluated because things change over time. And something that was maybe working really well is not working, or something is still working really well and you need to move on. So the business as usual approach is discussed in there, and I've seen this played out in organizations time and time again, especially if you've really spent a lot of time and energy on it and you just don't want to see that legacy end. But it really is time for it to end. There is some good evidence that either it's been taken care of, or that you're duplicating effort, or that you're not really meeting the needs of that clientele anymore. So this is an important takeaway in chapter 3. And I think that as you read that content, you will be shaking your head and go, I'm aware of programming that is doing business as usual, may not be the most effective thing we can do, certainly isn't efficient, and really we might want to take a more analytical approach. Program planning elements are also discussed in the chapter. Problem analysis, that's the needs assessment. That is phase 1. Phase 2 of the big project you're going to be doing in this class. You're going to be looking at, with a site coordinator, problems that have been identified by a statewide needs assessment to look at it in a little bit more of a precise way in an actual setting and how that plays out in the needs of a local clientele. Establishing goals and objectives, that's just a thing that we do, obviously, so that we can have something measurable at the end. What is our goal? What is our intended objective? What are our hoped for outcomes as a result of this project? So that's discussed. Designing the program, that's actually, I think that's the fun. But you have to think really big picture and critically about, am I really addressing the cause with what I'm implementing here? But together in the teams that you have, I hope that you come up with a really good program design. Developing a data collection system. This is actually the technical part. Like, how can I just collect the data? Am I only collecting it from participants? Are there other ways to triangulate the data? For example, you might have an intervention to reduce opioid addiction, which is kind of a big problem. It's a big deal in the state of Utah and across the nation. And you may say, oh, I'm just going to collect data from the participants and I'm going to ask them about their use now of opioids. Well, there's some problems with that, as you might imagine. We may not get a good idea on their self-report. It's just one piece of data that we can use. But wonder if we went to the health department, or wonder if we went to the ER documentation or data that showed us the opioid numbers coming into the ER, or wonder if we could look at other data about prescriptions. Now, some of this you might not be able to get access to, but I'm trying to get you to think about other ways to triangulate. Did we actually have impact? And of course, then you have to remember is correlation is not necessarily causation, and so there's a lot of things in the data collection part that are going to get messy. You're trying to pinpoint various ways, and we'll discuss that way down here in week 10 or something about data collection and data analysis. Developing an evaluation plan obviously is connected to the overall thing, because that overall goals and objectives. And if you haven't met your goals or objectives, that's a really big problem, but that's what you do in the plan, is figure out how you're going to measure your goals and objectives, that data that's going to be collected, and then in that evaluation, you will have the results you need to determine if things were effective or not. Understanding social problems, then, in that context of the chapter, I want to highlight a couple of things. You are looking at, is there a problem? And who is defining the problem? Now, they talk about stakeholders, they talk about clients. I want to put this beach ball photo that you have, and I'm going to use this to describe what I'm talking about. Let's get it right side up. But is there a problem? Who's defining that problem? If we are working in a community where we go to the people who have always supported us, that we consider our stakeholders, they might be funders of the program, they might be a small minority with a big wallet, or a minority of folks with historical input into our programs, or a very small minority that are just recognized leaders for whatever reason in a smaller industry within our clientele. If we go to stakeholders that are not truly representative of our entire group, our clientele that we're trying to serve, we have actually biased the stakeholders who are going to help us to define a problem. Who is defining the problem? You need to have as many different voices at that table as possible. You need to have the biggest picture you can get of the target that you're looking at. So that's why I have this beach ball, and I've used this to discuss issues when working with even middle school students. And you may have seen it before, but essentially, if I'm looking at this beach ball, I'm gonna step back here a little bit, I see number 3. But I can see that those of you looking through the camera can probably see 6. Maybe if I turn it slightly, because 6 is hard on that blue. There we go. Now I can see numbers 4 and 5, and maybe you can just see 1, and you say to yourself, no, I can see 2. We're all looking at this issue of opioid addiction. We're all looking at this issue of youth leadership, or youth development kinds of things, students at risk. Whatever it might be, nutrition programs, we're all looking at the same beach ball, but we are looking at it from a different point of view through our own lens. Your job as the person who's trying to really identify and understand the problem is to listen to all of these voices and try and come up with what is really going on within that particular issue. In this case, the beach ball representing that issue. So I want you to really think about who you're asking in a needs assessment. What is the need? And in the needs assessment we're going to be reviewing in this class, that was a statewide assessment. That was the assessment of the population of the state of Utah, not necessarily the stakeholders who fund, who have historically been part of the organization, but like, what do the people in the counties really think? What do the potential clients really think about programming and what is needed? So there is a distinction here between stakeholders and clients. You may have clients that are stakeholders, but that doesn't necessarily mean the stakeholders are representing or will be part of that client base. Make sure that you're thinking about that when you put it through that filter and the viewpoints of looking at a particular issue. Social problems are ill-structured. They are messy. It's just what they are. They're not going to be all tidy. It's not going to be able to like just zero and this is the problem, we need to fix it, because if it were that easy, you wouldn't even have to have a course or any of these program plannings or evaluation or any of that stuff. We'd be able to fix them immediately. But social problems are ill-structured. They have multiple facets. They might have a political issue that's on top of them. And so we have to really say, what is the best possible outcome given this ill-structured problem to address the thing that we see as the, kind of that dependent variable, the thing that we're looking at that we want to change. And so, yep, it's going to get a little bit messy. Your job is to try and to listen to all those voices. And I don't know if you're going to make everyone happy, but you certainly need to address the problem, and some people might not be happy about that. Social facts versus a social problem. Sometimes people are going to give you some facts that are in place, some things that are just like, this is the way it is. And we're really trying to say, are those facts related to our social problem? And they do a pretty good job of talking about that in chapter 3. And then perceptions and context, put those two things together, going back again to the speech ball example. You're looking at the same issue, but everyone's going to bring their own perception, their own point of view, their own background, their own experience. And your job is to sort it out with the facts to identify what the actual social problem is, putting that within context. Lastly, in that chapter, they have a problem analysis design, which I thought was really interesting. Let's see if I can zoom in here a little bit. Defining the nature of the condition, that's really going to help you as we move towards logic models, which were briefly discussed, I believe, chapter 1-ish, kind of overviewed. And in fact, I thought about putting something in about logic models here, but we're going to save that to what I call a little bit more of a teachable moment. But that is coming later, where we'll really drill into logic models. But in there, you really look at defining the nature of the condition. You talk about the situation. What is the situation? What do we know? What are the facts? And how are those terms being defined? So if you're using terminology that is not really, it maybe is clunky, you need to define early on, this term is being applied to make this definition of this group. I'll give you an example of my work with agricultural literacy. That may have a lot of different meaning depending on who you are and what theoretical lens you're coming from, to take a look at that. So I typically, inside of a situation statement in my logic model, would tell you how I am defining agricultural literacy. And you'll see that when we get into logic models a little later here in the course. 3, determining the characteristics of a population, making sure you understand what they are. They are demographic, they are maybe gender-based, they are socioeconomic, those kinds of things. Determine the scale and distribution, how big, how wide. Is this really something I should be spending my time and money on? Is it really going to have the big impacts that are being required of me within the organization I work for? 5, determine the social values being threatened. Is there a real problem? Is there consequence? Oh, so important. If I don't do this program, what are the consequences? And if the stakes are pretty low and they're not going to really move the needle, and in fact, if you went away tomorrow with that program, no one would really notice, you probably don't have a big enough problem to worry about. So make sure that there are some consequences. There are going to be real and measurable impacts, because there's just not enough time or resources to do something that's just not that meaningful. We all want to have meaningful things that we're working on. And if it's not that meaningful, if you're not that impassioned by it, it's just not going to last that long. And at the end of the day, when you go to evaluate it, no one's going to really care so much. So that number 5 is pretty important. And in fact, even when you get up here and you're defining the nature of the condition, you got to say, is this a big enough deal for us to spend our time on? That's really defining the problem. 6, determine the degree of recognition that it will have, kind of lumped in here with 5. 7, and your text does a better job of, kind of laying these out. Again, put them in context for the areas that you work in, and they give different examples. Women's shelters, I'm looking at the text for different things here that they might use. Determine who defines the problem. That goes back to those stakeholders. You know, bring all those voices in there into the room when you're really looking at the nature of the condition of the problem. The etiology, which is the cause and effect. Are we really treating the cause? Are we getting to the root, or are we just putting a band-aid on what the effect is? Like maybe trying to make it a little bit blurry or a little less noticeable. 9, assess the ethic and gender considerations, which honestly, that should have been considered really well over here when you're looking at defining the context and how the terms are being defined. But we're going to need to be able to assess those things at the very end, like did I meet any ethnic or gender considerations in this framework for defining or analyzing the problem. So I think that's a pretty useful tool and take away within this chapter. All right, that is a quick overview, relatively quick review of chapter 2, and then some highlights, putting the content into context, if you will, for chapter 3.